You know, I think she knows.
It was a bright Saturday morning at Willow Creek Park. Families scattered across the playgrounds, children laughing, and dogs chasing frisbees. But all that serenity shattered when two uniformed police officers spotted a woman sitting on a bench, calmly watching her young daughter play. Her name was Agent Simone Carter, a single mother, former top field agent for the FBI, and someone who had spent years protecting lives from threats nobody else even knew existed. Today, she was just a mom in the public eye, or so they thought. Why is she just sitting there watching? One officer whispered into his radio. Looks suspicious. Simone noticed them immediately, their eyes narrowing as they started walking toward her. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the awareness that she could neutralize any threat before it even realized it existed. She smiled politely at the approaching officers. Good morning, can I help you? One of the officers stepped closer. Ma'am, we're asking questions. Suspicious behavior has been reported in this area. Simone's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second. Suspicious. She had faced far worse than this in undercover operations, but this was personal. Not because of the accusation, but because it came from people who didn't know her true identity, her authority, or the skills she had honed over years in the field. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, standing slowly. I assure you, I'm just watching my child play, she said, calm, composed, but ready for action if necessary. The officers exchanged a look, clearly expecting her to stumble, to flinch, or to make a mistake. They didn't realize the danger of underestimating her. Because Simone Carter was no ordinary mom, the officers moved closer, their posture rigid, hands hovering near their belts. Simone remained composed, her eyes scanning the surroundings subtly, noting every exit, every possible threat, every civilian in the area. She was trained for scenarios far worse than a couple of overzealous cops, but she knew that confronting them incorrectly could put her child at risk. Ma'am, do you have identification? One officer asked, tone sharp, as if expecting resistance. Simone reached slowly into her handbag, deliberately moving with absolute calm. From the outside, it seemed casual, but inside, her mind raced through contingencies. She knew that once her identity was revealed, the situation could explode in ways these officers weren't prepared for. I'm happy to provide ID, she said, producing her driver's license. I'm also willing to explain myself, if you'd like to do this properly. One of the officers glanced at the license, then back at her, unconvinced. This doesn't explain why you were loitering suspiciously. Simone let out a soft chuckle, a sound both polite and unyielding. Loitering? I'm sitting with my child while she plays. The park is open to the public. Are you suggesting a mother supervising her child is suspicious now? The officer fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to back down. The tension in the air grew as other park-goers noticed the interaction, some watching curiously, others recording discreetly on their phones. Simone's mind was already running a mental map. She had options. She could escalate, she could defuse, or she could make them realize, subtly, that this was a mistake they'd regret. She chose the third option. I understand your concern, she continued calmly, maintaining eye contact with both officers. I know what it looks like from your perspective, but let me be clear. I am trained to handle threats. I've protected people and investigated crimes that make ordinary situations like this seem trivial. So I would suggest we handle this professionally and respectfully before anyone makes assumptions that could escalate unnecessarily. The officer stiffened. Something in her tone, her posture, and the quiet confidence in her eyes made them pause. They had approached thinking this would be a routine, suspicious person stop. They hadn't expected a presence of authority that commanded the space without a single raised hand. Do you work for law enforcement? One officer asked cautiously, sensing they might have underestimated her. Simone smiled faintly. Yes, and while I'm off duty and here as a mother, my training never takes a day off. So I suggest we handle this with professionalism. For a moment, the officers froze, realizing they were the ones being subtly put in check. A small crowd had gathered, sensing the tension. Parents and children nearby watched, sensing the power dynamic shift. Then, in the softest possible way, Simone delivered the subtle line that sealed the officer's comprehension of her authority. I'm FBI, and I assure you, you're about to learn a very important lesson about assumptions. The officers exchanged nervous glances. The realization dawned. They were not dealing with an ordinary citizen. They had targeted someone trained in negotiation, combat, and intelligence gathering. And now, she was fully aware of their every movement. Simone's daughter, oblivious to the tension, continued playing nearby. The officers, now aware of their mistake, tried to regain composure, but the situation had already shifted. Every move Simone made from that point onward was deliberate, measured, and controlled. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten, but her presence alone conveyed absolute authority. The officers finally backed down, muttering apologies, realizing that this suspicious mom was someone whose power far exceeded their expectations. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispering about the woman who had flipped the script on the very people who had come to intimidate her. And Simone? She simply watched her daughter play, a quiet, knowing smile on her face, aware that justice, however subtle, had been served. Once the officers finally retreated, muttering apologies under their breath, Simone took a deep breath, letting the tension dissolve like mist in the morning sun. But she knew this encounter wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem: profiling, assumptions, and systemic bias. She walked her daughter over to the swings, letting the girl laugh and play as if nothing had happened, but inside, Simone's mind was already analyzing the situation. She made a mental note of the officers' badge numbers, the body cameras on their uniforms, and the exact sequence of events. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just about personal pride. It was about accountability. Later that evening, she made the calls she knew would matter. A formal complaint was filed, not in anger, but as a record of the incident. Her voice was calm, firm, and precise. I am an FBI agent. I was targeted today in a public space for simply supervising my child. I expect this matter to be reviewed, and I will be following up personally. Within days, her report triggered an internal review. The department discovered multiple similar complaints from civilians in the same area. Simone's report became the catalyst for a policy overhaul. Officers were mandated to undergo bias and de-escalation training. Supervisors were required to monitor engagement with the public more closely. But the ripple didn't stop there. A video of the encounter, posted anonymously, went viral. People were outraged by the absurdity of targeting a mother at a park and amazed at how she handled the situation with poise, authority, and intelligence. Communities rallied to demand accountability, and the story sparked nationwide conversations about profiling, systemic issues, and respect for citizens, regardless of race or appearance. Meanwhile, Simone didn't seek recognition. She continued her work quietly, mentoring young women in law enforcement and intelligence, demonstrating that strength, intelligence, and composure could change outcomes without violence. Parents at the park began to notice a subtle shift as well. Officers became more aware, more cautious, and more professional. The park, once a place of minor tension, became a space where families felt safer knowing that accountability and awareness had been enforced. And yet, the final lesson wasn't just for the officers, it was for anyone who ever assumed weakness or underestimated a Black woman. Simone had turned a simple Saturday morning encounter into a lesson in courage, authority, and justice. By the time her daughter was tucked into bed that night, Simone reflected quietly. Justice had not come from shouting or threats. It had come from intelligence, strategy, and unshakable calm. She had flipped the script completely, and the world had noticed. Across social media, blogs, and local news, headlines celebrated the FBI mom who flipped the script at the park. But Simone knew the real victory was far quieter. The small but significant shift in the way people perceived authority, respect, and power. For every mother, for every parent, for every person unfairly targeted, there was hope, there was strategy, and there was a way to claim justice without losing dignity. And in that quiet, deliberate way, the law and life had finally been reminded. Never underestimate a Black woman, especially one trained to protect, to serve, and to outthink anyone who dares challenge her unjustly. Weeks later, the police department called Simone in, not as a threat, but as an acknowledgement of her complaint. The chief, a stern man who had overseen the officers that day, waited in his office, papers and reports spread across the desk. Agent Carter, he began, clearly uncomfortable, your report. It's caused quite a stir. Simone remained calm, her posture radiating authority. I expected nothing less. The purpose of the report was to ensure accountability and proper procedure. Profiling and intimidation have no place in a public space. The chief sighed, flipping through the documentation. The officers involved. They have been suspended pending review. We've also mandated bias and de-escalation training department-wide. Simone nodded, letting the information settle. Good. But I also want to make it clear that justice is not about punishment alone. It's about education, awareness, and prevention. If the goal is safety, then everyone involved needs to understand the consequences of assumptions and improper behavior. The chief hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. You handled that situation exceptionally. Calm, precise, professional. Most people would have reacted emotionally. Most would have escalated the confrontation. Simone's lips pressed together in a faint, knowing smile. That's what training and experience teach you. But it's also what responsibility demands. Justice isn't just a reaction, it's anticipation, control, and foresight. Word of the internal meeting leaked, and soon the story spread across local news. Interviews with Simone highlighted her role as both a mother and a highly trained FBI agent, capable of diffusing dangerous situations while asserting her authority. The public reaction was overwhelming. Social media exploded with praise. Viral posts highlighted the absurdity of profiling, and hashtags like hashtag Justice at the Park and hashtag FBMom flips the script began trending nationwide. Parents, community leaders, and activists began citing Simone's actions as an example of how courage and intelligence could challenge injustice without violence. Local governments used the incident to implement stricter accountability measures in policing, and nationwide discussion about racial profiling gained new urgency. Meanwhile, Simone continued her work in the FBI, mentoring young agents, especially women of color, showing them how intelligence, calm authority, and strategic thinking could make the difference between disaster and resolution. She became a symbol of empowerment, not through anger or aggression, but through composure, intellect, and justice. Even the officers who had approached her that day experienced a transformation. Initially embarrassed and defensive, they underwent training and reflection, learning firsthand the impact of underestimating someone based on appearance or preconceived notions. At home, Simone's daughter never fully understood the complexity of the day at the park, but she remembered her mother standing tall, calm, and unshakable. And as she grew older, she would carry the lesson that courage and intelligence could outmatch prejudice and bias at every turn. By the time the city council held a community forum on law enforcement practices, Simone's case was cited as a turning point. Citizens called for transparency, equity, and better training. Leaders, inspired by her poise and authority, realized that justice could be both firm and fair, and that respect could be demanded without aggression. Simone, sitting quietly in the back of the room, reflected. Justice wasn't about one confrontation or one viral story. It was about systemic change, about inspiring awareness, and about showing that even ordinary moments like a Saturday at the park could become catalysts for extraordinary transformation. And in that realization, she smiled. The world had witnessed a lesson that would resonate for generations. Never underestimate a Black woman, and never doubt the power of calm authority paired with intelligence. Months later, the incident at Willow Creek Park had become a case study in training programs for law enforcement across the country. Departments invited Simone to speak, not as a celebrity, but as a mentor and a living example of how intelligence, strategy, and composure could change outcomes. She traveled to conferences, schools, and community forums, sharing her story. But Simone always emphasized one point above all else. Justice is not about fear or force, it's about awareness, accountability, and the courage to act rightly even when it's inconvenient. Meanwhile, The officers involved in the park incident had gone through intensive retraining. They publicly acknowledged their errors, apologizing to the community and crediting Simone's conduct as a lesson in professionalism and respect. The department adopted new protocols ensuring that profiling and assumptions were no longer acceptable grounds for engagement. Simone returned to the park one quiet morning, watching her daughter play. Families waved at her, some thanking her for inspiring change in how law enforcement treated the public. The air carried a sense of justice, not punitive, but transformative. A local journalist approached her, camera rolling. Agent Carter, what would you say to other single parents or ordinary citizens who face unfair treatment every day? Simone looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and commanding. The greatest power you have is knowledge and composure. When you stand firm in truth, when you act with integrity and intelligence, you turn the tables on prejudice and injustice. Never let anyone underestimate you. Justice isn't given, it's taken carefully and deliberately with courage. Her words resonated far beyond the park. Social media erupted once again. Parents, young professionals, and community leaders shared her message, inspired by her poise, her authority, and her unwavering sense of justice. Even more profoundly, Simone's story ignited a nationwide conversation about racial profiling, respect, and empowerment. Laws were reconsidered, departments reevaluated their engagement policies, and citizens began advocating for change in their own communities. At home that evening, Simone tucked her daughter into bed. The little girl yawned and whispered, "Mom, you're a superhero." Simone smiled, brushing her hair back. "No, baby. I'm just someone who knows her worth, knows her power, and uses it for good. That's what heroes do." And in that quiet, powerful moment, the world had witnessed a truth that would echo for generations. Never underestimate a Black woman, especially one armed with courage, knowledge, and integrity. Justice is not always loud, but it is always inevitable. In the months following the park incident, Simone's influence spread far beyond Willow Creek. News outlets ran in-depth features highlighting her composure under pressure, her strategic intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Every interview she gave emphasized a key lesson. True power lies not in aggression, but in clarity, preparation, and self-assurance. Local schools invited her to speak to students about civic responsibility, equality, and the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. Even ordinary moments, she told them, can become extraordinary when you act with knowledge and courage. Her speeches were peppered with stories of her FBI experience, but always anchored to the real, relatable moment at the park. Meanwhile, the two officers involved in the incident underwent public retraining. They shared their experiences in workshops, explaining to fellow officers how their assumptions had put them and the public at risk. Their admissions were raw and honest, demonstrating how a single encounter could inspire reflection, accountability, and institutional change. Simone's advocacy didn't stop there. She collaborated with city councils and community leaders to implement policies ensuring equitable treatment in public spaces. Surveillance and body cam protocols were updated, bias and de-escalation training became mandatory, and neighborhood outreach programs educated both citizens and law enforcement. Willow Creek Park, once a symbol of tension and prejudice, became a model of safe and inclusive public space. Social media amplified her impact further. Viral posts celebrated her poise and intelligence, inspiring hashtags like hashtag FBI Mom Flips the Script, hashtag Justice in Action, and hashtag Courage Under Pressure. People shared their own stories of overcoming profiling and prejudice, creating a wave of public dialogue that reached national news outlets. Her example ignited a larger movement of awareness and accountability, proving that one act of calm authority can ripple outward, changing systems and mindsets. At home, Simone's daughter grew up surrounded by the lesson of strength through integrity. The little girl would hear stories of her mother's intelligence, courage, and composure, understanding that being underestimated could be transformed into an advantage. And as she matured, she carried those lessons forward, embodying resilience, confidence, and justice in her own life. Years later, community centers and law enforcement academies used the park incident as a case study, a real-world example of bias, courage, and the power of knowledge. Simone's role was celebrated, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of what was possible when a Black woman stood her ground with intellect, composure, and moral authority. Simone, however, remained humble. She continued her FBI work, mentoring young agents and quietly influencing change wherever she went. Her mission had never been recognition. It had always been justice, justice achieved through strategy, integrity, and unshakable calm. And the world had witnessed a timeless truth. Never underestimate a Black woman who knows her worth, her power, and her responsibility. One act of courage can ignite change across communities, systems, and generations. Simone stood one morning in the park, once again, watching her daughter play. Parents waved, children laughed, and officers passed by with respectful nods. The park had transformed. It was safe, inclusive, and emblematic of justice in action. She smiled, knowing that one Saturday morning had changed more than just her own life. It had altered the course of her community and perhaps the nation. Months turned into a year, and the echoes of that Saturday morning at Willow Creek Park continued to resonate far beyond the city limits. Simone Carter's story became more than a viral moment. It evolved into a movement. Civic organizations invited her to speak at town halls, law enforcement training seminars, and even national conferences on justice and equality. Every time Simone recounted the incident, she emphasized a crucial point. Power isn't about intimidation, and justice isn't about punishment. It's about awareness, intelligence, and strategic action. Her calm composure that day had not only diffused a potential confrontation, but had catalyzed widespread systemic change. The officers involved had since become advocates for proper community engagement. They openly shared how underestimating her almost escalated the situation and how much they had learned from her measured authority. Departments across the nation began implementing mandatory bias training, empathy workshops, and scenario-based drills inspired by her actions. A single encounter had transformed policing culture, setting a precedent for accountability and respect. Communities celebrated the change. Willow Creek Park, once a place where suspicion lingered in the air, became a sanctuary. Parents encouraged each other to stand tall against injustice. Children played freely, and families trusted that their voices would be heard if they ever faced bias or profiling. Simone's daughter grew up surrounded by the lesson of strength, courage, and integrity. She watched her mother navigate life with intelligence, tact, and unwavering resolve. And in those quiet moments, swing sets, sandbox castles, and soccer games, Simone taught her daughter something far greater than any lesson in school. Justice isn't given. It's claimed thoughtfully, bravely, and with composure. But the ripples didn't stop there. National news outlets highlighted the story repeatedly. Universities included her case in leadership and law enforcement courses. Activists and ordinary citizens alike used her experience to inspire campaigns for equality, safe communities, and systemic accountability. Simone's Saturday morning encounter had become a blueprint for action. When faced with prejudice, use your knowledge, remain calm, and assert your authority intelligently. Even years later, people recalled the story, the Black mom at the park, underestimated, challenged, and yet victorious. And every retelling carried the same message. Never underestimate a Black woman, especially one trained in courage, intellect, and justice. The officers, the public, and communities learned that true power is quiet, calculated, and unwavering. In her own life, Simone continued to lead by example. She mentored young women in law enforcement, shared her knowledge with future FBI recruits, and inspired generations to act with integrity in moments where courage mattered most. Her life became a testament to what happens when intelligence, calm authority, and strategic action converge. Injustice is met with resolution. Assumptions are shattered, and systems are transformed. One morning, she returned to the park, her daughter now older, running ahead freely across the green fields. Simone paused, taking in the sight of families enjoying the space, officers patrolling with respect and mindfulness, and a community thriving because they had learned from her quiet example. And as she watched, she reflected, Justice isn't about spectacle, it's about creating ripple effects that outlast a single moment. One Saturday, one calm, intelligent black woman had turned an encounter into a lesson for generations. And that lesson would echo far beyond Willow Creek, into communities, classrooms, and boardrooms, reminding the world that courage, intelligence, and integrity are unstoppable forces. With a final glance at her daughter laughing under the sunlight, Simone whispered quietly, "We've changed the world. One moment at a time." If Simone's story inspired you, subscribe to Dark Side of Luna and turn on notifications for more true life stories where courage, intelligence, and justice prevail. Share this video to empower someone today, because even a single moment of composure can ignite systemic change, and justice, no matter how quiet, is always unstoppable.